This is when I taught high school. This is what we called waiting for silence. You just wait. I called my wife a little while ago, and I told her if our daughter gets married, I'm ready to put on the wedding. I know all about chairs, table tents, white tablecloths, and everything you need. Before I start, I have a few what I call administrivia, some details. But I would like you to give a gentleman, Ray Shepard, who's trying to sneak in, a round of applause. Ray, as chair of the site committee, and all of the wonderful Boston volunteers have made this moment possible, and he is to be thanked. Okay, on the administrivia, first we have, unfortunately, a panel that we're having to pull this afternoon, and it's a very popular one. Andre Bernard is quite ill, and another panelist's family member had a heart attack, so we will not be having the funding panel this afternoon. Based on enrollment, that's a major disappointment, so what we're working on is a couple of things, because we're so high-tech these days, is putting on a video cast with the same cast of characters and creating some web resources. I know who you folks are, but we'll open it up to everybody, but we will try to somehow make up for that. So what you'll need to do during lunch, not while we're talking, is to look at your agenda and try to find a substitute panel for those two events this afternoon. We're deeply sorry about that. Next on the agenda is I'd like to explain the speed dating for those of you who are participating. Frankie, if you would mind standing up. Frankie is the coordinator of that event. She will be in the Alumni Lounge. Am I correct, Ray? Is that what it's called, the Alumni Lounge? And at the end of lunch, if you see her, she has your dance card, so to speak, your appointments on a separate card. We ask you to be very flexible because we may make a few changes as the afternoon goes. We have a few extra, not extra, but a few slots that we're still manipulating. So when you come to the Alumni Lounge, see both of us, we may have a few last-minute changes, but you do have your appointments all set up. At the end of the day, we would like to make sure that you turn in your badges. For those of you who are concerned about the Massachusetts Bay, they're all made from recycled vinyl, but nonetheless, we would like to get another year's use out of them. So if you would do that, that would be terrific. In addition, in your bags is a survey, as well as a form called 3 Things You Can Do for Bio. If you would complete those things and leave them at the registration desk, that would be terrific. Also, there's a sign-up table there for those of you from the New England area who'd like to join the Boston Bio group, but I'd like to also invite you to send me emails. We already know of one group in, what city is it? Not St. Louis. Anyway, there's several groups being formed. If you send me your coordinates, I can put you in touch with other people in that city, and we can spread these groups across the nation and the world. For those of you who had microphones or video cams in your room, I'm talking to the panelists and moderators right now, I'm chasing after you because you need to sign a form. It's a release form allowing us to put that on the CBS Evening News and other places. Who says people aren't interested in biography? So I'm going to be chasing you down. Some of you have already signed them. I'd like those back. And don't think you can leave here without having signed it. I know where you are, and I will get your signature. The University of Massachusetts bookstore has set up a lot of books by people from the conference for sale at the registration area. At the end of the day, we're going to have a reception in here where you can get those books signed, and they will bring the bookstore over here. So you'll have purchasing opportunities available to you during the course of the day and this afternoon, and I encourage you to do so. What I always say to my wife when she asks me why I buy so many of these books, I always say, if I don't, we're all in trouble. So please support these sales. Please now welcome the University of Massachusetts Boston campus provost, Winston Langley, who will say some words of welcome. This wonderful facility was made possible by him and by Nigel, and also you should be keenly aware that we have support from the university for all this video cam work and audio casting. So, Provost Langley, thank you.
Good afternoon. On the occasion of the Complete Biographers Conference, earlier today I sat in one of your discussion groups and admired the variety of experiences which were brought to bear on that discussion. And in a way, I must say thanks to you for having me in your august presence. Your role in the professional and intellectual area you embody and represent in helping humans to construct and reconstruct the past. In many cases, a past one may not have had a chance to personally experience, a past one cannot deduce from what we have come to call first principles, or indeed one that can be built from acts of the imagination, is of utmost significance. Not only does your work add to the multiple perspectives which must be engaged if we are to encounter more of the fullness of our past, offer some hope for the future of print, and minister to the curiosity of students who seek to link actual lives with the history about which they're asked to be acquainted. But this work is central to any effective dealing with what I see as a universal divide between our manner and modes of observing the past, and the modes and manner in which that past actually occurs. The University of Massachusetts, Boston, which strives to be a special site in the diversity of interrogations which shape human understanding and adventures in the pursuit of that understanding, is proud to host you and wants to say welcome to campus, welcome to a common conversation in shared experiences, welcome to the individual and joint pursuit of enrichment and refinement of your craft. Thank you.
Confession time. I've had a crush, a professional crush, that is, on Jean Strouse since 1999. I think I can mark the month April of 1999 when her book Morgan, American Financier, appeared. So it's a great honor for me and a privilege to be the one who's going to get to introduce Strouse as the first recipient of the Bio Award given to her in recognition for her contributions to advancing the art and craft of biography. Jean Strouse is a native of a sunnier state, California, and has been a variety of things that we've known her for. A book critic, a prolific writer of magazine articles, a recipient of fellowships, including ones from MacArthur, John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundations. Currently, she's the director of a center that anyone who's a writer should know about, Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, a valuable supporter of the kind of work we do. Her book, Alice James, a biography, won the Bancroft Prize in 1980, and her second biography, the one about Morgan, was widely acclaimed for its realistic portrayal of the man and its lucid explanation of his financial work. And I want to just simply talk to you a little bit about that book as an example as to why we honor her today. The work is an enduring testament, as well as a model worthy of study for any of us, for two of what I think are the essential skills one must bring in writing a biography: and one of the reasons why our craft is so charming and attractive to us. First, you must be able to portray the life of someone else or another person who is not like us. What other business do we get to do that? Inhabit the skin of somebody very different than we are. And the second is perseverance in reaching that goal. Strouse decided to pursue Morgan after spending 5 years writing in her own words about a female invalid in a family of intellectuals. And if you think about it, everything that her previous subject was, Morgan was not, and everything she wasn't, he was. But like a portrait artist, say John Singer Sargent, with a new subject sitting in the studio, Strouse picked up her charcoal and began her preliminary sketches. After a mere 5 years of research on both sides of the Atlantic, Strouse began to write. The man who emerged was quite unlike that of any of the stereotypes of Morgan that populated our histories. Instead, her canvas held a portrait that humanized and thus made real one of our nation's mythic figures. But to do this, Strouse had to gain an education in the world of finance. I floundered for years, she said once, trying to get my bearings by reading as much as possible, talking to experts, and sitting in occasionally on business school courses. Finally, it turns out a friend, and we all have them, who was an economist with many years of experience in financial markets, jumped in and taught her how to think about individual deals, finance, and economics, and how to make sense of the financial aspect, which is the important part, or one of the important parts of this tale. But she was not home free. She said, at a certain point late in the game with Morgan, I thought I really couldn't write the book. Sound familiar? I was drowning in arcane financial information, and even worse, I couldn't hear his voice. I hadn't been able to imagine my way into his experience. Over several awful months, I slowly found ways to solve those problems. At least I hope I did, she said humbly. And in retrospective, she continues, I think that crisis was an extremely important part of the process of learning about him. Maybe we learn the most from the hardest part of this work. This is typical of one of the reasons we honor her, is her frankness in sharing what we all share in private in our studies and giving us hope that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on that second skill. It takes perseverance to find a way to portray the life of another who's not like us. In Strous's case, it took a mere 15 years to pull it off. Her struggle not only gave us the best book on Morgan, but a biography that shares traits, in my estimation, with one of America's greatest novels, a novel that also begins with the letters M and O, Moby Dick. If you like Moby Dick, you know what I'm talking about. Her book is sprinkled with long asides on finances, history, and art that provide the reader with the wherewithal to understand Morgan. If you think about Moby Dick, you know how Melville did this with these long sections, the iconographic representation of the whale in medieval cathedrals. I think I made that one up, but it's pretty close. And it seems like it has nothing to do with the plot, but it describes aspects of the whaling business, but you can't get the plot, you can't get through the book without those key sections. But I want to end with this thought that unlike Captain Ahab, Strouse was not destroyed by her quarry, but triumphed in her relentless pursuit of her subject, and has given us a book that will endure in our business as a model, just as Moby Dick endures in literature. So don't call her Ishmael, but rather it is Jean Strouse, a biographer of the ages, and the first recipient of the Bio Award that we welcome to our conference today. Nigel, if you would come up. Yeah, you both need to come up. Nigel Hamilton, the first elected president since Debbie Applegate, where are you, has stepped down. There she is, has just stepped down as interim president. I should say, don't be despairing. I've lured Debbie into a number of tasks, some of which she doesn't know yet. But anyway, Nigel is going to present Jean with her award. And so you don't get the sense that we're really cheap. We actually have a real bronze award, but I discovered it takes a lot of weeks to cast bronze. So we've made a replica for the ceremony. So if you two maybe would stand here. And then the photographer can get you two.
Thank you very much. I'm not quite tall enough. Can you see me? Well, wow, thank you very much, Jamie, for that fantastic introduction. I feel I really don't need to say anything now. And thank you, Nigel, for the award. And it's really a tremendous honor to be receiving this wonderful prize from a group of so many distinguished biographers. So I'm delighted to be here and really honored. And it's also fabulous to have so many people here who really want to be thinking so deeply about these questions that we're all engaged in with varying degrees of pleasure and difficulty. But it's really, this is a great organization and a great day. The informal title of my talk today is The Unknowns, loosely borrowed with a large measure of irony from Donald Rumsfeld's famous statement, as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. I don't know where weapons of mass destruction fits in there, but not in biographies. Even after we, as biographers and historians, have spent years in libraries and archives, have read countless books, and conducted exhaustive interviews, there remain a great many things that we cannot know about the lives we study. Some of them we recognize, and some of them we don't even know we don't know. We sometimes uncover them as we go along in the process. As Jamie said, it took me 15 years to write about Morgan. I've often felt that other biographers maybe should pay me a little tithe because I make them feel good that they're not taking that long. As Jamie also said, I do currently run a Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. We give fellowships to people who need to use the research collections of that library, independent scholars, academics, creative writers. Fellows come for a year, and near the end of one year, we had an informal seminar just among ourselves on the subject of biography. Some people, a few of us had written biographies, some were embarked on them, and just seemed like it would be a good topic to talk about more among ourselves. Several minutes into the conversation, a historian who was writing his first biography asked whether any of us had any rules, any clear rules about biography. People talked for a while, and then I said, well, I have one rule. You can never say, he must have felt X or Y or Z. The person who had asked the question groaned and put his head down on the table, clearly having violated that rule. Our talk continued for a few more minutes, and then a playwright who often asked the most interesting questions and came at things from delightfully quizzically angles said, I think you can say, he must have felt, period. Which is wonderful, but it isn't too helpful if you're writing a biography. It's great if you're a playwright. Few signals make me distrust a writer more than that small phrase when it includes a direct object. He must have felt, she must have thought, they must have known. I just think, how could you claim to know that as a writer? Unless there's direct primary evidence. If you have a letter or a diary saying something like, I was devastated by her remark, or he was thrilled to get the news, that's fine. But otherwise, I think we can't claim to know what our subjects felt. We have to respect these known unknowns and find ways to work around them. Of course, we also have to tell stories, since biographies, I hardly need to tell this audience, are a great deal more than just the facts. And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about my own work and as ways of sort of working around where there are those gaps of what you really want to know and don't have direct evidence for. While I was writing about Alice James, who was the younger sister of Henry and William James, I learned at least as much from novels about what it was like to be a member of her extraordinary family as I did from the arguably more primary sources of letters and diaries, although those were invaluable as well, especially from this family. To give a brief example, most of the grown James siblings described their childhood as an intellectual and emotional paradise, and their mother as an all-giving saint. Alice recalled Mary James's, quote, extraordinary selfless devotion as if she simply embodied the unconscious essence of wife and motherhood. Her brother Henry went even further, writing after their mother died, she was patience, she was wisdom, she was exquisite maternity. It was a perfect mother's life, the life of a perfect wife, to bring her children into the world, to expend herself for years for their happiness and welfare. Then, when they had reached a full maturity and were absorbed in the world and in their own interests, to lay herself down in her ebbing strength and yield up her pure soul to the celestial power that had given her this divine commission. Whoa, that is not supposed to be fiction. Henry's novels, on the other hand, add to a considerable body of evidence that undermines his autobiographical portrait of divine maternity. There is not a good mother in all of Henry James's fiction. And the mothers of his greatest heroines, Isabel Archer, Maggie Verver, Minnie Thiel, are conveniently dead. Maternal figures in James tend to be grasping, selfish, terrifying creatures. Some of them feed off the souls of their innocent children, like vultures or vampires. Others are so remote and self-absorbed as to be irrelevant or inadvertently destructive. Of course, we can't read fiction as biographical fact, but that James never created a mother imbued with anything like the divine abnegation he ascribed to his own suggests that he recognized aspects of Mary's character that were more complex than perfection. Mrs. James's own letters and behavior and the observations of family friends present her as a cold, intrusive figure who wielded self-sacrifice like a club and had little sympathy with the emotional troubles that plagued all 5 of her children and her husband. Why they all felt called upon to beatify her in this way had to do with the peculiar, interesting dynamics of this family. And over the 5 years of my work, I slowly came to understand those dynamics as I learned about Alice. In a sense, Alice James did not have a story to tell when I started to write about her. Like other 19th century women who did not become famous, which is to say, most of them, she was known, if at all, as the sister of famous men. During the 5 years it took me to write the book, people I met would ask what I was working on, and when I'd tell them, they'd look completely blank, and some asked, "Is this your thesis?" So I had very low expectations of what would happen when this book appeared. The biographical story for Alice turned out to be an internal psychological drama, not unlike the plot of a Henry James novel. It took shape in my imagination. You could say that I found it, to some extent, in the gap between what Alice experienced and what she said about what she experienced. And the story only grew clear after years of immersion in her letters and diaries, other family papers, Henry's novels, William's psychology and philosophy, the books Alice read, and in ancillary subjects like women's history, social history, and the young science of nervous disorders. There's a lot more to say about this, but I'm on a strict time limit, so if we have time for questions afterwards, I'd be happy to talk more about Alice James, but I'm going to move on to Morgan. By almost comical contrast to Alice James, Morgan had a gargantuan story that had assumed mythic proportions on both sides of the Atlantic. He lived at exactly the same time as the Jameses, my Jameses, lived the second half of the 19th century, but his life led in entirely different directions, which was part of the reason I chose it. As after Alice, I wanted to learn new things and blithely turned from, as Jamie just said, from an obscure female invalid in a family of intellectuals to one of the most powerful actors in American history. I didn't realize how much I had been able to stand on the shoulders of the Jameses, as it were, to use their observations and reflections, even if I didn't always take them at face value, until I had completely changed channels. The Jameses lived in language, and I pretty much live in language. They were fascinated by what was going on in their own and each other's minds and imaginations, and were extraordinarily articulate about it, always searching for precise ways of expressing their particular experiences. Morgan could not have cared less about language. Neither introspective nor articulate, he was, as Henry Adams said of Theodore Roosevelt, pure act. He never explained why he did any of the things he did, either in the financial world or in the realm of art collecting and culture. When the James family were young, they were in New York, and they went to a production of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 1850s. Years later, Henry, in his very long-winded autobiography, wrote about 4 pages about this little incident in the 1850s. J.P. Morgan, living in New York in the 1850s, also went to a production of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I didn't hook up the exact dates, but they were close. He wrote in his diary at the time, "Mrs. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, bus ride, 5 cents. Kind of hard to get a purchase on this man. His silence actually became part of his story. He attended a dinner in his honor in Chicago in 1908, and the next day the Chicago Tribune ran the headline, "Money Talks, but Morgan Doesn't." After I was working on this for several years and I gave a draft of some of the early chapters to my editor, Jason Epstein, he said, "Stop looking for his inner life. He didn't have one." Well, that's what I knew how to write about, so it was a pretty hard thing. I found one of the reasons I did this book, aside from the fact that it was very different from Alice James, was that Morgan had been drawn in caricature. It was a very political subject, and there was lots of political spin and no consensus about who this man was. His admirers saw him as the Napoleon of Wall Street, a modern Medici prince, and the financial Moses of the New World. His critics regarded him as the boss croupier of Wall Street, a great financial gorgon, and this next is a combination of 2 quotes, "a bull-necked, irascible man with fierce, intolerant eyes set just close enough to suggest the psychopathology of his will." The first part of that comes from, it's been a while since I've talked about this, Dos Passos from 1919, and the second part comes from Dr. O's Ragtime in 1975. So this was pretty much the view of Morgan, those 2 pieces, for most of the 20th century. About Morgan's second career as an art collector, there were equally conflicting assessments. Bernard Berenson, who was an art advisor mainly to Isabella Stewart Gardner, visited Morgan's house in London where he was keeping many of his art collections and wrote to Mrs. Gardner that it looked like a pawnbroker's shop for Croesuses. And Roger Fry, who was working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an assistant curator of paintings when Morgan was president of the museum, said memorably that a crude historical imagination was the only flaw in Morgan's otherwise perfect insensibility to art. That's been indelible, that wonderful line. On the other hand, Wilhelm von Bode, who was director of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin and worked closely with Morgan on many of his collections, called him the greatest collector of our time, and several other quite distinguished art experts agreed. Roger Fry's deliciously nasty assessment of Morgan was widely accepted by art historians and critics, as well as by me when I started on this project. I thought that Fry, the English connoisseur and critic of the visual arts, would be my guide to Morgan as collector, since I already kind of knew him through his Bloomsbury associates, Virginia and Leonard Woolf, Vanessa Bell, John Maynard Keynes, and I trusted his judgments and credentials. What I found was truly a surprise. Late in 1904, not long after Morgan became president of the Metropolitan Museum, he invited Fry to be an assistant curator of paintings there. Fry was interested in the job because he needed money. He was living in London. He needed money to support his invalid wife, 2 children, the travel that was necessary to write about art, and the distinguished fine arts journal he had founded in 1903, the Burlington Magazine. His first letters from New York were enthralled. "I'm having a roaring good time among these millionaires," he told his wife in early January 1905, "and what's more, I find them a sympathetic, agreeable sort." Morgan had promised him, quote, a free hand with the Met's pictures, Fry continued, and as he has complete control of the whole thing, that means an assurance. Also, he promised me money for the Burlington, pretty much whatever I wanted. Morgan offered Fry $8,000 a year, which would be about $120,000 in today's dollars, and that was guaranteed for 5 years, plus expenses to travel to Europe and freedom to lecture and write. In Morgan's presence, Fry reported he felt, quote, like a courtier who has at last got an audience, and as though for a few minutes I wielded absolute power. Over the next few days, however, Fry decided that, quote, for so big a job for which I am well fitted and for which they couldn't get anyone else, I ought to be paid really well. Having been offered $8,000, he asked for $12,000. Morgan dropped the negotiations. Fry was wrong about fitting the job better than anyone else. Later that year, the Metropolitan Trustees hired Edward Robinson, who'd been the director of Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, to serve as assistant director and curator of classical art in New York. Early in 1906, the following year, Fry accepted a lesser post at the Met as curator of paintings for $2,500 a year, less than a third of the original offer. You didn't want to blow your negotiations with Morgan. Fry's appraisals of Morgan rose and fell with the tides of his own fortunes. When the banker seemed well disposed toward his recommendations and financial needs, Fry described him as friendly, mellow, and genuinely committed to the big, quote unquote, American future in art. When the Met overruled or ignored him, however, Fry denounced its president as obstreperous and a brigand. In 1907, a year after what I was just describing, Fry hoped to change his title at the Met to European Advisor on Paintings with no cut in salary, which would leave him free to spend more time abroad. And when Morgan invited him to Perugia to see an exhibition of Umbrian art and conduct a private tour of the region, Fry took it as a good sign. You may guess from this, he wrote to his wife, that Morgan has become very affable to me and seems quite willing that I shall have my own terms with the museum. As he is omnipotent, that is everything. In Italy, Fry was pleasantly surprised by the potentate's character and taste. He met Morgan with his mistress, Adelaide Douglas, that is Morgan's mistress, in Perugia in late May. The next day, the group went through the exhibition where, quote, says Fry, Morgan was received like royalty without any notice of his coming being given. Somehow he has touched the imagination of people as no other millionaire has. He enjoyed himself hugely and really loves to go about to the churches and see things that he can't buy, which I like in him. Indeed, I've got on wonderfully with him in this mood. From Perugia, the travelers drove to Assisi. Fry described their reception as incredibly comic. The town was in a state of frenzied excitement, all the Franciscan monks hoping to get Morgan to give them money to buy back their convent, bowing and scraping and opening up their sacredest treasures. Poor St. Francis's marriage with poverty seemed to have brought forth a strange offspring. This is still Fry, but the thing was not so crude after all, because to my surprise, Morgan was deeply impressed by the lower church, thought Giotto's Raising Lazarus the finest picture he'd ever seen, and generally displayed a kind of intelligence which I hadn't expected. Fry's admiration continued to grow. From Paris 10 days later, he reported buying some fine things for the museum and some superb ones for Morgan. He's more colossal than ever in his purchases, but also much more intelligent. He's mighty pleased with me. Probably with Morgan's blessing, Fry did change his job at the Met that fall, but he rarely came to New York after that, and the museum's board ignored most of his suggestions. In 1909, Fry recommended a Fra Angelico Madonna to the museum, but Morgan bought it for himself. The Met's directors, expecting Morgan to leave his collections to the museum and beholden to him for countless other benefactions, maintained a discreet silence whenever he bought something out from under them this way, which he did, but Fry was outraged and fired off a letter of protest. Morgan sent it on to a museum official with a note across the top, "This is the most remarkable letter I ever received. I do not propose to answer it until I see you." He never answered it. 6 months later, the Met terminated Fry's appointment, and saying that his services had not been up to expectations for some time. Fry blamed his dismissal on Morgan, but continued trying to sell him things and praising his splendid collections. Decades later, however, he took retaliatory action. He wrote a vivid description of the 1907 Umbrian trip and gave it to Virginia Woolf, who published it in her 1940 biography, Roger Fry. In 1907, Fry, according to his letters home, had been struck by Morgan's intelligent responses, huge enjoyment, discerning appreciation of Giotto's Lazarus at Assisi, and interest in things he could not buy. In long retrospect, he said exactly the opposite. Quote, Morgan didn't know how bored he was going to be with the frescoes at Assisi, where there was nothing one could buy, wrote Fry. Assisi was a failure. Mr. Morgan was displeased with the condition of the frescoes. Mrs. Douglas would have liked to have improved her mind by pumping me on the history of the church and Giotto, but we were hurried away since Morgan was not enjoying himself. Continuing at extremely entertaining length in this vein, Fry delivered the summary judgment I quoted earlier, which has defined Morgan as collector for generations of scholars and writers. A crude historical imagination was the only flaw in his otherwise perfect insensibility to art. History is subject to a tyranny of the articulate. That's not my line, it was my editor on my Alice James book, but I think it's really true that people who speak well and write well are the people we want to quote as we're looking for evidence about the lives we study. And Fry, Roger Fry, had the weapon of artful, powerful words in his contest with what he called the big man, a contest that Morgan barely noticed. Flummoxed by an implacable force he could neither sway nor disconcert, Fry resorted years after the fact not only to scorn, but powerful fiction. It seems doubly ironic, then, that the novelist Virginia Woolf published it as fact. Morgan left so few records in his own voice for the last years of his life that it is possible to see him mainly through other people's eyes. You could even really say only through other people's eyes. Biography inevitably includes elements of triangulation, locating an unknown point by reference to two known points, which is not the same as saying he must have felt. But the known points for the aging Morgan rarely yield straight lines. His wealth and power so affected people's perceptions of him that he could not tell whether they were responding to him or to what he could do for them, and they often couldn't tell either, as I've just described with Roger Fry. I found this same bending of the sightlines in the accounts of a great many people who wrote about him. And since this distorting effect of power and wealth was an integral part of Morgan's life, I decided to make it part of the narrative. This was one of those places where I was stuck. I really needed just more life in these last chapters, more dazzle, more sense of who this man was, and I couldn't do it with his own words. The second to the last chapter in the book is called Portraits. It looks at Morgan through the eyes of several people: his librarian, Belle de Costa Green, a young archaeologist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art named Herbert Winlock, who traveled to Egypt with Morgan in 1911, Lady Victoria Sackville, the mother of Vita Sackville West, with whom Morgan had a romantic skirmish in his early 70s, the photographer Edward Steichen, who left a brilliant portrait of Morgan, the photograph that you probably all know, which A.L. Doctorow told me was all the evidence he used for his portrait of Morgan in Ragtime, that great Steichen photograph, and through novels by E.M. Forster and Henry James. Howard's End, which refers to Morgan by name, and The Outcry, a late, not very good Henry James novel about a rich American art collector in England. I was very lucky that I had so many voices like this, so many people who were articulate and did write things down. My hope was this chapter would create a kind of hologram, in effect, recording the light scattered from an object, in this case Morgan, and then reconstructing it from multiple angles, as if the object were actually there at the center. I hoped that readers would take in the multiple stories and see the man they'd been reading about for, by this time, 627 pages. Just as I had finally, after more than a decade of reading and writing and thinking, come to see Morgan myself. I think something like that holographic process has to happen between subject and writer to make a biography come to life. Something transforms the accumulation of research, facts, sources, information into a story that makes sense of the experiences in question and feels, to the writer and ultimately to the readers, intuitively true. In an essay on Edmund Wilson several years ago in The New Yorker, Louis Menand wrote about that intuitive knowledge. Quote, novelists sometimes say that they invent a character, put the character into a situation, and then wait to see what the character will do. The historian's character, this is still Menand, the historian's character has to do what the real person has done, but there is an uncanny way in which this can seem to happen almost spontaneously. And I think that, in my case, with just two subjects, it does. You listen, you live with people, you learn their voices, you begin to get a sense of what they will do and what they won't do. After years of listening to biographical evidence, the character does come to life in the imagination of the writer, if we're lucky. He acts or she acts consistently like himself or herself. New evidence fits the picture we've already developed, or it doesn't, and we have to change the picture. Disparate testimony starts to make sense. There's nothing mystical or fictional about this process. It is what Menand calls, quote, the true positive of historical work. Thank you.